Everybody. So today we're going to talk about chapter 5. So the first section, let me go ahead and share my screen. Maybe. The first section we're really going to get into is talking about marriage equality. Then we're going to, and adoption. Then we're going to get into military-related discrimination, and then we're going to talk about workplace and housing, and then we're going to talk about sexuality and social control. And I think we can pop through this one, hopefully, in one go. So why this matters? Sexual orientation is not protected by law. It is not a protected status. Many states do not have laws protecting LGBTQ+ rights to adopt. Federal hate crime there is federal hate crime legislation, but not all states have it. And so unless the case becomes a federal case, and that is not always possible, then the hate crime then gets tried as either sometimes gets swept under the rug, sometimes gets murder charge or an assault charge, but does not have the hate crime associated with it that deems it a more escalated punishment or sentencing. There's nothing to protect LGBTQ+ in the military, which we're going to get into. We're also going to talk about sexual assault as a big problem in the military in general. So we're going to talk about that even with the heteronormative structure, but we're going to talk about how gender intersects with military and those particular and the atmosphere of violence and sexual assault. And then we're going to talk about how many queer people find it hard to find LGBTQ+ friendly landlords and or mortgage brokers, and how that can impact housing security. Then we're going to talk about how all these issues kind of intersect with other identities, as always. All right. So when we talk about marriage equality matters for a variety of reasons, not just because it should be something that's not discriminated against depending on what your marriage looks like. And while you can have religious ideologies that don't necessarily include marriage as an institution is actually a social structure. It generally had nothing to do with religious ideology up until I don't know, post capitalism parts of Europe. And really that was because marriage and its concept is really a part of almost all cultures. Almost all human cultures have this idea of marriage, but it can look very, very different. And marriage didn't have really much to do with love or romantic inclination or even necessarily sex for a good portion of human history or the concept's history. Really what marriage was about was a social institution to track property lines, to track lineage, to track reproduction, to track maybe statuses, like even in matriarchal societies where the husband would then come to the wife, like to the wife's family, or if you didn't marry, you stayed with your wife's family anyway, or with your mother's side and lineage. So marriage just became this idea of, and in most cultures, for most of its ideology, it was about women as property. And as property to sire an heir to distribute ownership of some form of property, whether that be land, whether that be capital, whether that be whatever it is. So these current modern ideas, Western ideas of what marriage is, really are structured on this idea of marriage tied to citizenship or tied to specific legal protections or specific legal rights that it garners you. And we're going to kind of talk about that. But specifically, it gives you the right to make medical decisions in it gives you the rights in the way of citizenship, in the way of medical and funeral decisions, in the way of economic privileges. And so when we're talking about citizenship, we're talking about like literally the ability to be a citizen you can garner by marriage, the ability to extend visas. It garners you the ability to, once you have got that citizenship piece or a marriage as a citizen, it garners you those options to adopt, those options to get into other social institutions, and carry a specific kind of weight. And so when we talk about the medical field and funeral field, it gives you the right to make medical decisions in emergency, the right to visit your ill partner or child or a child within that relationship. And it gives you the rights to make funeral arrangements should something, should death happen. And those are big deals. And there's been a lot of cases where situations of family who did not respect a person's sexuality can garner that partner completely null and void or out of decision-making processes in very important moments, solely out of the fact that those next of kin relationships end up being the family members that may or may not even be close to them at that point, over the partner that could have been there for an extended period of time because they lack that ability to be married. And then it also garners economic privileges, including tax breaks, being able to put your partner on benefits packages, including healthcare and all of that with work. It includes military benefits, it includes inheritance and things, property values, and mortgage or leases, and sublets and some things of that nature as well. And as we talk about this, I also want to draw your attention to the fact that within the lectures and modules, I also did put the old lecture I used to do for a sociology of law class about the legal battles that garnered specific rights to LGBT persons and or are still being waged. And so it's really just about LGBTQ plus persons and the law. And it's a very big, but it has the entire legal pathway that got marriage equality in 2005 and its limitations. So that's in a PowerPoint, but if you guys want me to do an actual lecture for this, shoot me an email and I can probably get that done sometime this week, so that you guys could have access to that as something to just think about. Or if you just have questions over the information that's in the specific PowerPoint, you can just shoot me those questions as well. Moving along to kind of adoption, we're going to talk about that it is federally legal for queer people to adopt as of 2016. But this is currently being battled in the courts again. It will probably consistently have some push and pull back. Given the nature of the courts currently, there is some concern about that, given the most recent ruling that adoption agencies with religious affiliations, so like Catholic adoption agencies and all of that, can turn away queer couples as possibilities to both foster and or adopt kiddos. Seems counterproductive to placing kiddos in homes and allowing kids to have we have so many people in the foster care system that don't have placement, and so limiting those placements seems odd to me. However, they do have a legal right currently to do so. And it is, however, it's not extended to federal services like the actual DHS offices and things of that nature. So in every state currently, you can go through the state and be a foster parent and or adopt. However, those processes can end up lacking in resources and or not have the same weight as some of the institution or some of the groups like adoption agencies and things of that nature. And so allowing those agencies the ability to reject people really limits the access queer folk have to adoption. Agencies also can turn away LGBT. We just talked about that. LGBT parents make up 4% of the adoptions, which is a big deal given that it has only been recently that has even been an option or been even socially viable. And so the fact that already that percentage is 4% of those adoptions is is a really staggering number because of the amount of obstacles that are A, still in place, B, have historically been in place, and see that the legal right didn't even get there until 5 years ago. So it'll be interesting to see how that number moves as we push and pull and we see some of that discourse possibly change or continue to get more progressive. And then it also, when we talk about adoption, we talk about the limitations of the second parent's rights. So this comes down to sometimes in legal situations, one parent might be a biological parent, like with my children. My partner and I have raised my kiddos since they were very, very young. But I am biological parent, so I'm allotted certain legal rights that my partner doesn't necessarily have. And we've butted up against multiple hospitals for her right to be at bedside during major procedures because I have a medically complex kiddo. And we fought many a hospital over this to the extent that they're like, well, if bio father was here, then he could be here. And I'm like, well, but bio father doesn't raise these kids. It's the two of us that raise these kids. But because she is not, and she can't legally adopt them without bio dad losing all rights, it's very, very, it gets very, very wonky. And so like her ability to be legally anything to these kids is solely dependent on whether or not a biological parent is present, because without that, she lacks the legal capabilities to do a lot of things and make a lot of decisions. Now she's been written in a lot of ways, but we've had to make legal circumstances for that to happen. We've had to create that. And that's very limiting when it comes to parenting, even though socially that's who those kids' parents are. And it seems very interesting to really talk about how some of those things can be very, very, very detrimental to parenting rights and just the kids' overall welfare in general, because it can create obstacles in very important medical, social situations where things need to be handled quickly. So now we're going to go out. We're going to talk about the military for a little bit. So the military, we're going to talk about LGBT queer in the military for a little bit first, and then we'll get into sexual violence. So this is that point where I'm going to tell you that if sexual violence is one of your precursors, maybe you turn this off, and I will, and you can get back with me if you need more information, or you skip through that slide to get the information about the rest of the stuff. But LGBT bans were based on this idea of sodomy charges, and those were throughout the nation. But through most of military history, that's how they would ban LGBTQ plus persons from being in the military. And they would do these things starting post World War II, really, where they did things called gay soldier hunts. And essentially they would take and this was whether you were perceived to be this or it was an actual status that you carried and held identity to and flaunted. So this got used as a mechanism to rid of people who push back in any social format or was not socially what they wanted the idea of that military to be. And it included things like imprisonment, dishonorable discharges happened very frequently, and torture. And that's aside from the general assaults and other things that were happening to queer people within the military at the time. And then you got Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 1994. And it operated until about 2011. And it ended up, the goal was to make sexuality a non-issue in the military. But what it ended up happening was creating this space where you could exist as long as you didn't outwardly show who you were. And so what it did was create this space where if you didn't pass as the thing that you were supposed to pass as, and somehow you got created as this, you did tell, this piece of legislation ended up being used as a way to reprimand queer people who were outwardly queer or who weren't able to pass in the ways that socially they wanted them to pass. And then that gets us to the trans military ban. It ended technically in 2015, was reinstated by Trump in 2018, and then was again ended in 2020 by President Biden. And I'm sure that will go back and forth again. And there's a lot of pieces to that as well. But most of them are funded on this idea that going back to this transphobia and homophobia that is very directly correlated to military ideologies. So now we're going to get into sexual assault in the military. So again, this is your cue that if this is a conversation that you do not need to be a part of, then that is okay. Stop the video now. And then you can just pick up the other information in the other slides. So we're going to talk about how sexual assault is a huge problem in the military. So much so that they have their own entire divisions dedicated to trying to kind of compensate or do this. But when you have social control, especially bodily control, as one of the main core tenet fundamental principles of a social institution, such as the military, sexual violence tends to become part of the things that create and maintain that structure of control. And when you tie that into kind of the homophobia and things of that nature that are directly corresponded to that, it leads to explicitly lesbian soldiers having a very, very high percentage of sexual violence happen to them as this, we will turn you straight if you're going to act this way kind of mentality, or we're going to enact personal violence against your body in order to create that social control. And then harassment of women is very high in the military. 50% or more experience this. Sexual violence is highly underreported because of the hierarchy heavy ranking system that happens within the military, and this complete the social mechanism of not going against your superiors. That in and of itself creates a dynamic that makes reporting very, very hard in that social environment, along with creating safety for that person that does out those things. In and of itself has a lot of moving parts, and it is incredibly hard to do so. Sexual assault of men was not even acknowledged as a possibility in the military until 1992, and a lot of that stems down to sexual violence has a long history of being part of social control and a social measure of war. It is something that we have taught soldiers to do to enact fear and to establish dominance in war settings. And so having to peel back all of the layers of what makes that tick in the historical narrative as part of sexual assault's connection to war and the military is creating a space where the sexual assault of men wasn't even a conversation until 1992, and really sexual violence against women was later than that. So these conversations are really hard, and it's something that is moving, but not moving at the expediency that most of us who work in sexual violence prevention would like it to. But it's also one of the reasons why shining a light on it and talking about it is so important. So moving forward, we're gonna get out of that. A reminder that your helplines and your victims counsel are down here in the corners as useful measures if you know somebody who has expressed this having happened, and or if you yourself have had this happen, so that you have your numbers. We're going to move into workplace discrimination. Legal battles still rage about this, right? And we've seen it recently with the trans woman and Amazon having a hard time finding a non-transphobic employment space for them within the Amazon company. Amazon company has in and of itself a lot of discrimination suits out there right now. But there's definitely some tied to LGBTQ plus status. In 2020, the Supreme Court labeled sexuality as protected by the civil rights protections. Sorry, there's a typo in there. However, that was on the basis of sex. And so if it did not have a gendered or sex element to it, like a then you kind of missed that line of legal discrimination. Not to mention that you have to have the means and funds and accessibility to be in a legal battle when you experience discrimination in the first place, which is incredibly hard to do. Only 29 states have laws protecting LGBTQ plus workers. The Employment Non-Discrimination Act is an act that has been consistently proposed to Congress after Congress after Congress after Congress for an extended period of time, and it is something that cannot seem to be passed based on partisan lines. And it's something that would add sexuality as part of something that cannot be discriminated against for hiring, firing, promotion, all those markers. And then you have the discrimination rates become really, really, really high when it comes to workplace, especially for trans persons. And it usually ends up being based on the idea of passing. And we kind of get into this in one of my genders classes. So if you're interested in this topic, there's some more readings we could do on this if you are interested. And then we're going to get into housing. There are only 29 states that protect LGBT persons when it comes to housing as well. And there's a chart on page 115 that really talks about the different kinds of things that can happen to you in the way of housing discrimination. And that's everything from you have a landlord that verbally actually harasses you, that you experience physical violence based on the area that you're in, that you experience things like your not being able to find like economic institutions, banking institutions that will give you loans for buying of a house. You can find, despite your financial situations, and or you can see neighborhoods or real estate agents that will actively keep you out of certain neighborhoods that you may be interested in based on your sexuality. And then economic inequality also ties to housing insecurity. So when you have trouble finding jobs or having economic security, you're going to have harder times finding housing security. Those two things pretty much go hand in hand. And that kind of goes without saying. And then we're going to talk about social control. As one of the measures, they were talking about this idea of normal deviance being this BDSM or maybe your dominatrix, that kind of idea. Those are kind of what was considered social or normal deviance within our social society. Acceptable forms of deviance. You have pathological deviance, which is like your ideas of pedophilia or sexual violence. And then you have something like reinforcing deviance, which is this idea that sex work reinforces those social norms about sex, but does so in a way that is deviant. So you're paying for something that is still heteronormative or what have you, but it's still deviant in the way that you're paying for it, and the way it's being produced. So these are kind of forms of deviance, but also just kind of to further that conversation, social control can be created based on violence, based on sexual violence, based on social sanctions. Again, going back to some of the things we talked about with gender, your social control mechanisms are going to be very similar here as well. And so that's all I have for you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And that is the end of chapter 5. Again, if you guys are interested and want me to do that lecture on the legal battles that got us to where we are on several of the different things, I can update it for sure, because I don't think I have the most recent term for the Supreme Court on it, but I can put that on there and I can do that lecture too. If you guys are interested, just let me know. All right, I hope you guys have a wonderful couple of weeks and get through this module well. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to ask, and I will see you next time.